welcome to another workshop in our series of NAM Diverse Intelligence workshops. And we have a special treat because we have actually one of our Diverse Intelligence Fellows speaking to us today, Damia and Blasi. Damia joins us from the ICREA. He's a research professor there at the Center for Brain and Cognition at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. He has a very long list of accomplishments, so I had to write them down. He's a Schmidt Sciences polymath. That sounds pretty cool. As well as a National Geographic Explorer and a Branko Weiss Fellow. He has received a Rising Star Award from the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, and another Rising Star Award from the Association for Psychological Science, as well as the Glushko Prize for Cognitive Science. He's here to talk to us today on the computational wealth of linguistic diversity. So please join me in welcoming Damia.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's never not awkward going through all of the list. Well, I want to start, first of all, I'm extremely thrilled to be here. I'm visiting old friends and making new friends in this week. It's an amazing group of people. And I would like to start with a clarification. Some of you have reached out to me asking what happened with the title of your talk, because until a week ago, you have this title. So originally, I was trying to align with this mission of maximizing the diversity of intelligences and minds, and I thought, all right, I'll go with a bang, and I will talk about languages and agriculture and Holocene and language evolution, yada yada, and then I happened to see the list of workshops, and I realized there was a common factor there. Everything was about AI. So I imagine you have a whole week of extremely interesting and insightful AI courses, and you have this one guy talking about, prehistoric symbionts, whatever that is. And I thought, all right, I'll try to do something a bit more tailored to the spirit of this event, and that's why I decided to switch to something more aligned to AI. This is some of the stuff I was going to tell you about is incipient research of mine. I'm not what you would call a canonical AI researcher. I don't pretend to be one. But then, spending the first couple of days here, I realized that actually there was this interest in diverse intelligences, and we have been talking a lot about comparative cognition and all kinds of weird things like mine. So I thought, all right, I'll make a compromise. So the narrative backbone of this computational wealth, it's still there, but I have minimized a lot of the more specific AI components in favor of a broader view of my research. And it's, I guess that it's a common malady among academics that you keep changing slides until the very last minute. And I try to do a number of things, probably not succeeding in any of those. Some parts will sound more like a lecture, others will be like my very niche interest that probably no one else cares about, and but I really try to maximize the transmission of information to what is a very, very wide audience. One more thing I'm going to say is I'm going to bring up a large gamut of ideas. I'm not going to pursue all of them, so for the sake of us going through the content, which is not terribly long, I think this will take 50 minutes, maybe a little bit more, but not more than that. I would ask if we can stick with clarification questions. Also, I know that my accent and speech rate sometimes make things a bit less transparent. So if I said something that doesn't make sense, please ask me. Probably, So, all right. Let's get going. First of all, I want to give you an introduction of what is it I do. Depending on how you count and how to conceptualize what a language is, there's between 6,500 to over 8,000 languages, mostly spoken, but also signed in the world today. And the whole business of how to count languages is an extremely interesting and niche interest of mine. I'm not going to pursue now. And I have to say that I belong to a tradition that has stressed the enormous amount of diversity and variation in essentially every single dimension of description of the world's languages. Languages differ in the strategies they use to package information, in the way in which they tessellate the world in different lexical categories, in the information that is obligatory expressed versus optional, in rhythm, and a long, etc. And I have to say, for the last 15 years, my intention has been to try to make sense of this diversity, taking tools from a broad pool of disciplines. I'm originally a physicist and computer scientist, but I spent the last 15 years in departments from evolutionary anthropology, from cognitive science, comparative linguistics, which, as you can predict, was amazing when going to a job market. Can tell you other stories later. So there's a number of research lines of mine that I'm not going to be able to discuss, but I just wanted to list them in case there is some coincidence. I'm going to be here for the next few days, so just let me know if there's anything that rings a bell there. Originally, I work on the computational description of large-scale variation in languages. I've done work on language evolution. Then for the last 5 years, I've been working more on the applied side of linguistic diversity, asking the question, what are the real-world consequences for human equity and fairness of the fact that we have all these many languages? And I've done a little bit of policy as well. Then I'm also interested in the problem of communication across intelligences. How is that we can communicate with other animal species, for instance, and if possible, if it makes sense. And finally, this idea of how is that AI is going to change language, if at all. But we'll go in a different direction. So first of all, like I said, when you put together these notions of reasoning and computation and linguistic diversity, perhaps the first gut reaction is to think of the huge difference in resourcefulness that exists across the world's languages in language technologies. And there is a lot of literature pointing to the fact that, unfortunately, we don't have all of the data or the performance in language technologies in all of the languages we would like to. And I've done work in this direction, even if it's not what I'm going to be talking about. There is one result that I would like to highlight. A few years ago, we published a paper where we look at the large number of publications in the field of language technologies. And we did a number of analyses. One of those was the question of, is it the case that the more languages you involve in your language technology, whatever that is, does it pay off with more cumulative citations over time, which is our basic currency as academics? And the answer was a surprising no. That once you control for individual fields, there doesn't seem to be any benefit from involving more languages in the technologies you're developing, which is very disappointing. But I will be talking about something slightly different. And the starting point is that I would like you to think of languages not just as linguistic objects, as they're studied typically within linguistics, but instead, I would like to make the point that languages are also these repositories of biases and templates for cognition and for reasoning. Sorry, there you go. I hate it when people rush through the slides and I'm like, okay, but before we get there, I want to start with a caveat, and that is that while language might enhance or support efficient cognition and reasoning, it's not a necessary condition. So I'm going to present some case studies to illustrate this. So first of all, most of us are used to tallying with numbers, using numeral systems that we learn through our languages, for instance. And there's a number of very interesting observations in small-scale societies, in this case, for instance, the Chimane in the lowlands of Bolivia, that show that performance in a bunch of different numeric tasks, like matching a number in one side of the table and another with different items, seems to be mediated by your knowledge of the word that represents that magnitude, right? So if you are in possession of a numeral system and you know the names of the word of the numbers, then you can succeed in that task. Otherwise, it gets much more noisy. So that suggests, well, clearly there's something going on there. But another thing as well is that we know that there is a number of languages, today mostly in South America and Australia, that don't seem to have ostensive, productive numeral systems that are not bounded. So the question is, well, is it that we didn't need to count or to keep track of quantities before that? And the answer is no. As a matter of fact, we have plenty of evidence for hunter-gatherer societies that they use material artifacts where they did tallying in those artifacts and didn't need to use language for doing that. So they externalize a problem that we solve with language now using a material extended cognition type of process. And as a matter of fact, so last year, with Francesco Enrico and other people, we argue that there is a number of Paleolithic artifacts that have notches, and when you study the distribution of those notches and all the properties of those artifacts, they pretty much align with ethnographic artifacts used for tallying. So maybe we've been counting in this way for the longest time. So it's not innovation. Language, yes, makes it easier perhaps in certain circumstances, but we can totally do it without language. Another example, something that really perhaps the most important transition in my thinking about language that has happened recently is home signs and home signers. Home signs, according to some definitions, are these systems of communication that are developed by deaf children who are born into a hearing family without access to a conventionalized and named sign language. And there is differences in what people believe that these individuals are able to absorb from the language. They're deaf, they cannot understand the language, but they still get to communicate. And because of that, the early literature essentially treated them as a lesser kind of existence, right? You don't have access to language, hence there's a lot of things that you cannot do. Well, let me tell you something. A month ago, a little bit more than a month ago, I was visiting Monoranjan and Puja in Northeast India. They're deaf from birth. They develop a home sign with all of the signatures that people have described in home signs. And these are some of the most incredibly talented people I ever met. I learned how to play carom board, for instance, with Puja without language. She told me all of the rules. I know how to play. In case you don't trust me, we can play afterwards. And Monoranjan it's an extremely talented person. He is the main mason in his village. I stay in a house that he himself built. And the question is like, how does he manage to build structures without access to language? Well, so people go with a phone and they show him what they want, and the guy knows how much material, what kind of cement, what type of materials he will need, and he's able to do that. Not only that, he's able to coordinate groups of 10 people to build structure. I have hours of videos of him doing this. It's really fantastic. So, we got to see them playing pranks and doing complex financial operations, paying people. So, they don't have language, but they're still able to do a lot of the things that we believe are core to human cognition. So, another thing to mention as well, there is work by a bunch of people, including Tom, Tanya, and Ryan, showing how there's some circumstances where language might actually hinder some reasoning tasks. Perhaps the most famous of those is the verbal shadowing, overshadowing effect, which is when you see a phenomenon, you describe it, and describing it make you less likely to pick up the right solution in a referential task. Say, you watch a video, there is a person you have to pay attention to, then there's two conditions. One, when you describe the face of a person, another one when you don't do that, and then at the end you see that if you have described it, then performance falls if you want to pick up that person among faces of similar people. Why is that so? Well, there's many hypotheses. One possibility is that by verbalizing what you're observing, you're producing a representation that is competing with the pre-verbal conceptual one. Okay, and again, I don't think I have to argue much for this. Once language is present, then we see all of these boosts and streamlined aspects of reasoning that seem to fall in some sort of language structure, right? We don't use only language to bolster and structure our own thinking sometimes, but we can also recruit reasoning by other individuals through language. So again, I think that to an audience that has language, this should be straightforward. But one point I want to make as well is that it's important to see how different languages have different effects on cognition and on reasoning tasks as well. And this is being, someone who doesn't believe in Sapir-Whorf did that. What happened? Okay, there we go. All right. So, and this is, again, the history of this field is super interesting because every 20 or 30 years we go from believing that language plays a huge role in cognition to believing it plays no, to believing again that, and I'm not going to get into those details, but I'm going to mention some relatively recent observations that I think suggest that there is an interplay. It's more complex than we usually think about. So perhaps the most straightforward example that people like to bring up has to do with the presence of dedicated lexical items that provide further detail in specific semantic spaces. For instance, in the case of English, and again, I'm not a native speaker, so I'm relying on your intuitions on this. I think it's perfectly fine to say these two sentences. John thinks Mars is a planet. John thinks Serbia is in the European Union. One of those is one of the statements is true, the other one is false, but you're using essentially the same verb. Now, there's all languages where you have other conventionalized, sometimes lexicalized solutions for distinguishing these two possible situations. A situation where you or someone believes something that happens to be true, or you believe something that happens to be false. And what people have argued, having this distinction, having a dedicated verb or construction for distinguishing these two things, might bolster the performance in the false belief task, which is considered to be one of the metrics for the evaluation of theory of mind in humans. Another aspect has to do with memory. So we can characterize a phrase as right branching or left branching. A phrase, depending on some theoretical paradigms, has a special word called the head, and that word is going to dictate how the whole phrase behaves. Things, for instance, in English, you could say something like the sailor or the sad sailor who comes from Manchester. In all of those cases, and again, depending on which analysis you believe, you would say that, for instance, the word sailor carries all of the important information for how that phrase is going to behave elsewhere, right? So if the modifiers, if the extra information that comes on top of that head comes to the right, we are talking about right branching phrases. If it comes to the left, we'll talk about left branching phrases. In the case of English, we have both, as you can see here, but most of the time people would say that English is predominantly a right branching language, so you can characterize the whole language. And in opposition, you can say a language like Japanese is exactly the opposite. It's very left branching. So why is this important beyond language? Well, there is a beautiful paper I like to cite by Federica Amici, and in case you have any further doubts or questions or appraisals of this study, you have Federico Rossano there, who is the senior author, and they did something very beautiful, which is to ask, all right, so think about the following. You are exposed to a language that is permanently asking you to do different things. In one case, when you have a right branching language, you encounter the head, so you know what kind of phrase you're dealing with, and you keep absorbing information, you compile, bam, that's what happens. In a left branching language, instead, you have to collect information and wait until the very end to know what the head is. So you have to keep a lot of information until the very end. And the question is, does that spill over to memory of sequences more in general? So they try a number of different conditions. For instance, they have faces, they have numbers, spatial patterns, etc. And they ask the question, well, what happens with the recall function? So if we ask people who speak different languages to solve these different tasks, do we see any irregularities? And in fact, they found something that is directly consistent with their expectations, which is in a right branching language, you are much better at recalling recent elements, whereas a bit worse at recalling earlier elements, and the whole pattern is more or less flipped with left branching languages. And again, none of those stimuli, none of those sequences they tested are linguistic in any obvious ostensive way. So that also shows how the structure of your language can play a role in memory. Again, perhaps this is one of the most well-known differences across languages. We know that depending on the estimation, maybe 40 to 50% of the world's languages rely on tones. And there has been a number of very interesting studies over the last 10 years. One of those, tapping on over 500,000 subjects, show that being exposed to a tonal language your whole life actually makes you better in these tasks of melodic discrimination. In melodic discrimination, you need to have a very precise model of what the pitch of the melody is. And so it's not surprise, right? You're exposed to a system that requires you to pay attention to pitch at a very short scale with high precision, and then you can transfer those abilities to any arrangement of pitch contours. Finally, and again, English is a terrible language. English, don't get me wrong, right? I have friends who speak English, so it's great. I like it. I speak English most of the time. But for some purposes, it's not great, and this is one of those. There is a huge distinction in the world's languages that have to do with the type of alignment, like how do you code or mark different components of sentences, right? So most of the world's languages are what you would call nominative accusative up there, where the form of the subject of an intransitive sentence, like the mouse eats, is the same as the subject of a transitive sentence, the mouse eats cheese, right? In the case of ergative, languages, you have the complementary pattern where the subject of the intransitive is coded in the same way as this object of the transitive. Like you can see this with pronouns in English, right? You can say something like I eat or I eat pasta. I, same thing, right? But I can say something like, I'm so bad at thinking examples with English all the time, and Spanish as well. But you can say something like, that butters, or that butters me, right? My pronoun there change form is different from when it was in subject position, okay? So how you code different components of sentences. And there's something very important about what happens with prediction over time with these different languages. Because if you're dealing with a ergative language, the moment you encounter the first argument, you already know whether you're dealing with a transitive sentence or an intransitive one. Instead, if you're dealing with a nominative language, the moment you encounter the first argument, you don't know. It could be intransitive, it could be transitive, right? So what's going on with that? A few years ago, we tested what was the online processing for speech production in speakers of both different type of languages, and we found something very cool, which is that in the case of the nominative languages, you focus on the agent of an action, which is usually the subject, because that's the only thing you know that's going to be encoded. Instead, in the case of ergative speakers, because you already know what's going on early on, then you can focus on the whole scene from the very beginning. Suggesting that there is extremely short scale effects of the language you're exposed to, even in visual perception, at scales that we wouldn't be able to recognize as meaningful maybe just 20 years ago. These are just 4 examples out of many, many others. Now, what's going on with LLMs? Now, there is a lot of extremely interesting, this is a very emerging discipline and observations, and some of those might be contradictory at this point. But one thing we know is that when we are dealing with multilingual LLMs, for instance, there seems to be some evidence that in a large number of tasks, in particular many reasoning tasks, there seem to be a transfer to a reasoning language. It's usually a high resource language, right? So even if you prompt the model using any language, and you just translate into something that internally looks like English, and you just go back to the original language. And if you force the system to perform the reasoning in the smaller languages, then performance drops in whatever task you're dealing with. But at the same time, we also have evidence that sometimes in these multilingual tasks, performing the task in a language other than English might yield the best performance. And some of these cases are really surprising, I have to say. Now, what's going on here? One part of the explanation has to do with the fact that clearly you're training corpora that is not perfectly aligned. So whatever is being discussed or talked about or reasoned about in different languages is different. So there is a difference in baseline knowledge that is encoded in these different languages. But also, we start to see a similar type of evidence as we see with humans here. And there is very little research, and I would encourage anyone interested in this to push in this direction, because I think this is going to be a source of very interesting insights within the next few years. This is a paper from last year, for instance, when they observed that when it comes to Mandarin, they seem to have more iconic description of causal chains. You say something like toaster heats, bread toasts, and aroma spreads. But in English, they seem to be a much higher amount of promiscuity in the way in which you arrange these otherwise clear, temporally arranged elements. And what they did is they developed a task where they essentially test the performance on iconic and non-iconic sequences, and they found exactly what they expected, which is, Mandarin works perfectly and better than English in many iconic sequences, and the opposite is true with English. It's just the tip of the iceberg here, but I expect that we are going to see more effects linking specific aspects of the grammar and the discourse of languages with differences in performance. Okay, but by far it seems that the most exciting development recently in this direction has been the combination of multiple languages, multi-language prompting, some processes that combine different languages in the single model to arrive to a more robust and usually more efficient solution for reasoning problems. And there is, again, we still don't know why things were like this way, right? Why recruiting more languages make the models better? But one extremely exciting possibility is that by adding all of these different languages, what you are having is a more crisp representation of the world through the differential specification of grammatical structure that different languages enjoy. So let me make that argument again. The fact that different languages differ in the focus and the obligatory marking of different things might help at coming with much more rich representations of the world in general. And those are the things that these systems are tapping on. Again, we don't know if this is correct because we're just starting to understand how these systems work, but I think it's extremely promising. And that is going to be my excuse to tell you about the weirder stuff. Because the next question I have for you is, what are the limits of the design space of languages? And again, what is the idea here? If it is the case that representational diversity is playing an important role here, we should go to the weirdest possible languages, get them, and get machines that are more intelligent in a way. Now, there's a number of problems with this because we don't know what the limits of languages are for a number of reasons. First of all, and this is a paper from a decade ago, but I don't think things have changed much more since then, about 40% of the world's languages don't have a full-fledged description. We might have a sketch of a grammar that maybe some missionary wrote like 300 years ago. We might have a few word lists, but probably little else. So we don't know a lot of what's going on. And this is very important because there's many different types of language structures that are conceivable in principle that we don't get to observe. And the question is, well, we don't see them. Is that because there is something about humans that dislike those structures? Is it just because we don't know? Another huge problem that has been the source of my salary for most of the last 15 years, I have to say, is that we don't have 6,500 independent experiments. Instead, what we have is a handful of extremely aggressive and successful cases of demographic expansion that have completely reshaped the face of the cultures and languages in the world. And a lot of these events are very recent in terms of the timescales of culture. You have the emergence of these large language families, as they are called, over the last 9,000, 6,000, 2,000 years. So we don't get to see a lot of what if a language went in this direction because of the overrepresentation of these language groups and content. And I'll go back to this later. Now, and again, this is another point that is extremely intuitive. There's many aspects of language that are completely dictated by pressures that take place here and now that are derived ultimately from basic human biology and perception. There's some things that there's so much memory that we have. There's so much articulatory effort that we can produce. There's so many things that our brain can compute in a given amount of time. So it makes sense that those things have imposed a bit of a structural perimeter to the space of possible languages that could exist. Now the question is, are these experiments and theories that show the limits of language also useful for understanding what is the observable contemporary linguistic diversity? And I would say, mainstream cognitive science would say, absolutely yes. You can run an experiment. You can test, for instance, 2 observable language structures, and then through learning or cooperation task or transmission task, or by plugging in an LLM, at the end of this process, you will see a preference for the language type that is more represented in the world, right? So it's not only that these pressures that determine the limits of language, that those are active, again, in the frontier, but also they tell us which things are frequent and infrequent. And this is fantastic. Because if we don't embrace this assumption, then we have to go from what we know from human minds to social dynamics, social interaction, all kinds of different social sciences playing out there. Then you get into human history that is dominated by completely orthogonal stochastic events, like someone domesticated a type of plant, bam, they're super popular now. And finally, those things feed into observable linguistic diversity. But if you believe there is something about human preference that you can capture in a laboratory experiment, then you can skip all of that. You don't need to do all of the dirty field work. You can just have your laboratory see what are the human preferences and derive all of the expectations out of those extremely controlled and highly preferable contexts. There's another thing as well. If you believe this is the case, and linguistic richness is following human preferences, first and above all, then probably the reason why we don't have some of these languages we didn't get to observe, you could argue something like, well, if there was any advantage for those language types and we don't get to see them, then maybe they're just not good at all. So what we get to see, the small sample of observable languages, maybe those are the optimal solutions for whatever problems languages are solving, right? So what you get to see and we can capture now, that's what it is. The problem is that when you look at actual naturalistic data, things look much more messy and complex. So first of all, there is this appealing idea that if you want to blame anyone for the structure of language, then first you go for children, right? Because they're not very smart, have a lot of constraints. So this has been still is a very influential idea. But when you look at what actually happens, two things are extremely important to highlight. One is that by the time they are completely socialized, they behave pretty much like the rest of the people around them. So many of the things that we would be able to blame to developmental circumstances don't persist enough as to become a part of the pool of the linguistic structures that characterize the language at large. Things might have been different in the past when children were much more abundant. But when you look at historical evidence, then it doesn't seem to be the case. Another idea is, for the longest time, there was this notion that it was critical to talk and to talk a lot to children, and that impinged on general development. It was extremely important for development of intelligence and languages, and there's no way you can transfer the knowledge of an extremely complex language without input. Now, over the last 7 years, we have beautiful, detailed data on the type of input that children receive, and we get to see that even if people are not talking to them, if they're just playing around, they're able to master some of the, descriptionally speaking, more complex languages out there in the world. And even if you think there are differences in performance across languages, something very funny happens. And I always love to bring up this study by people in Aarhus in Denmark. What you see there, that's the vowel space of Danish. Like I struggle, like my French is terrible, you don't want to hear it. But that's even worse. Like all of those vowels, the points there mean that articulatorily speaking and perceptually speaking, they're very close. It's extremely hard to master. And I was told that it's a running joke among Danes that language is so difficult, we just speak in a different language to communicate. Well, so this seems to actually pan out in observable differences in the acquisition of the vocabulary of children learning Danish. So what you have there is the number of items in a comparative table. So you have a questionnaire, you ask parents how many of these words does your child know, for instance. And what you can see is that children learning Danish are lagging behind. And in this case, Danish children are some of the wealthiest in the world. So you cannot blame SES in this case. So there seems to be something, presumably the very complex vowel space of this language, that it's hindering the acquisition of the elements of the language. But we have no evidence that Danish is becoming simpler for children to acquire it earlier or anything like that. It doesn't make a huge difference. We humans are not optimizers. We do what we have. Now, when it comes to language change, I think our intuitions of how rapidly languages change is also extremely biased. When you look at languages that have remained mostly out of intense contact, and we have a number of cases for which have like over 1,000 years of evidence, like the case of Georgian in the Caucasus, for instance, or the case of Icelandic, we get to see that other things being equal, they seem to change more slowly. So language change is not this instantaneous thing that is taking over. It might be now in our societies, but probably wasn't the case earlier. And also, there might be some evidence that the preferred dynamics of language change is not one of constant permanent change, at least when it comes to the core grammar, but instead that linguistic diversity might enjoy periods of stability and then bursts of change, most of the time driven by external factors, like just a whole group of people coming in, and then a lot of language contact happens, things change. So, what if this idea that there are things that we are trying to optimize occurs, but not in regular language change, but in the emergence of languages? So there's one type of language that has been brought up again and again as a center point of discussion of what's going on with the ultimate nature of languages, and those are Creole languages. Most of the languages that we describe as Creoles have emerged over the last 500 years, usually in the context of colonialism, when you have a small group of people, most of the time from West Africa, but also from all parts of the world, in contact with a large and diverse set of folk speaking different languages. And within a few generations, those places might end up developing a full-fledged language called Creole. Now, when you take a look at the vocabulary of Creoles, most of the time you can readily see what the main colonial language was that we call the lexifier, because it provides most of the vocabulary. So these are a few selected words from a few Creoles that are lexified by English around the world, and you can completely see, without me having to tell you what the phonetics of those symbols are, that they are derived from English. So vocabulary, yes, they're taken from these powerful languages. But when it comes to grammar, people have argued for a long time now that they seem to share a number of regularities. And for some people, the fact that all of these different languages end up with similar aspects in grammar might tell us something about the prior on what the preferred language will be, like something like the default grammar. One general story with some simplifications might go like this. You have a bunch of different people that coexist. Individuals are forced to communicate. Then there is a pidgin, which is a very limited communication system. So people have to communicate. They need to coordinate tasks. So they come up with a very simple system, which you wouldn't call a language. And that pidgin, along with some input from the other languages, is filtered through children, and they infuse the structure of a full-fledged language. Or maybe adults play a role, and they are finding the most efficient solution for communication. You see what the point is here, right? That Creole is conceived as an opportunity for humans to come up with the best possible structure for communication, which is presumably what you want to do in these cases. Almost 10 years ago, we looked at the largest database of Creoles, and we contrast them with non-Creole languages, and we ask, okay, is it the case that the grammar of Creoles are systematically different from the grammars of other languages? And we found that yes, that was the case. It was very easy to distinguish which language was a Creole on the basis of the grammatical structure alone. But if you look at what languages are, with Creoles are misclassified as non-Creoles, then you have Creoles that exist outside of the Atlantic, and when you look at the non-Creole languages that were misclassified as Creoles, you find languages in West Africa and West Europe. At the same time, when you ask what are the features that discriminate Creoles from non-Creoles, you see there is an abundance of features that seem to be particularly present in West Africa and West Europe. And if you know anything about the history of humanity over the last 500 years, you know what's going on here. You don't need to appeal to any type of cognitive prior, because what's going on is that Creoles look alike because they are the outcome of a fairly regular process of combining one West European language, most of the time, with a West African language. And when languages have a different heritage, they look very different from those. So, and we didn't have any evidence for systematic innovation. We didn't see a smoking gun argument saying, aha, this is something universal that always happens when humans come up with a new Creole. That's not the case. History is just enough to explain this. Much less elegant and appealing to the brain, but it is what it is. Now, there's another possibility as well. What if evidence for these strong functional pressures are not observed in the emergence of languages, but instead in the complementary process of language dormancy? This is when languages cease to have any active users. And we contrast these languages, we call surviving languages, against vital languages. And we ask, all right, what happens? Do we see any systematic change in languages that are not being used anymore, that are not being transmitted anymore, not used as much? And there is, again, a very abundant literature suggesting that when languages are not used anymore, there's a number of things that happen. One of those is the systematic simplification of the language. There's a number of possibilities why this might be the case, but one of those have to do with the notion of complexity, right? You learn all this grammar, super complex, lots of exceptions. The moment you stop using it, then the things you're going to forget are all of those small pieces, and you come up with a very simplified model of what the language is. And because of that, people have claimed that surviving languages look alike around the world. and they're very simple. You see where I'm going with this. We run an analysis, we look at the same grammatical descriptions of the language when it was vital and when it stopped being vital. We look at languages that were related, one that was vital, that wasn't vital, look at a bunch of different linguistic features, and what we found was that using different models and parameterizations of this idea, we found no difference, grammatical differences between surviving and vital languages. So what's going on here? Well, we ask, can we explain what we observe through contact? Because most of the time, not always, when languages go dormant, they're in contact with a different, larger language at least. So we ask, well, are the changes that people in the literature have adjudicated to obsolescence and language dormancy can be explained by contact, by the fact that there's no language around? And the answer was yes. Most of the time, the changes that people have observed as having to do with language not being used can be explained by contact. But this still leaves a question there, which is, why is that for 80 years we thought that these languages were simplified? And the answer is very similar to the answer as with the case with creoles. Because when you look at the literature, and that's what we did, what you find is that the overwhelming majority of cases that have been described as surviving languages come from the Americas and Australia, where languages have been in contact with English, Spanish, Portuguese, and those languages are not particularly complex from a cross-linguistic point of view. They don't have a lot of morphology, which is what people use to assess complexity. So again, we have a historic, and as a matter of fact, we found a number of cases where a language that is not being transmitted anymore becomes much more complex because of the frequent contact with other languages around you. So again, it's just contact and history explaining what's going on. Now, but this is a point where we get to the aha moment, where people would say, well, fine, let's say that you didn't find evidence for this, but how do you explain that when you look at almost any linguistic feature in the world, there is a dramatic skewness in favor of some configurations over others? Some word orders are much more frequent than others. Some categories that we grammaticalize are way more frequent than others, and that happens everywhere. So why don't we have something like this, where if there's no functional pressures, why is that like just humans randomly sampling for the options they have around? And to give an answer to this, we need to look at the last 12,000 years, the Holocene. And this has been the most eventful period in the history of our species, at least a recent period of our species. And this changed absolutely everything about humans. It changed how we interact with other individuals. Some people believe that human psychology has changed because now we live in large aggregations with individuals who are not necessarily our directed kin. We develop sedentary occupations. We conquer almost all of the biomes around the world. We have seen the rise of moralizing high gods. There is plenty of genomic evidence of a multitude of different adaptations that have to do with these processes. So there was a lot of change over the last 12,000 years. And the question is, all right, what happened with languages then? And the answer is, we don't know. And we don't know because, with the exception of very few languages for which we might have some written evidence in the past, we don't know almost anything about what was happening in the past. But that didn't preclude people from speculating what happened before. And again, I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but people have spent a lot of time thinking, for instance, that before the rise of agriculture and animal husbandry, there were 12,000 languages, for instance. Why? Well, sounds about right. But there is a number of, even if we don't know about languages, there is a number of things that we do know about past stages of human societies and human groups. One of those is that if your main subsistence comes from foraging, hunting, and gathering, there's so many people you can coordinate at the same time. And that imposes a natural limit to the number of people who can share the same language. And again, I'm not giving you any of the details, very interested in talking about this if you find this interesting, but by combining paleo-demographic estimates and observations about the organization of ethnographic groups, then we can arrive to a wild but still interesting estimate on the total number of languages that have existed over the last 12,000 years. So as I said before, now we are about 6,500 to 8,500 languages. We estimated there was a slightly lower number of languages 12,000 years ago. But this is where things get interesting for our argument, which is just 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, this was this dramatic bottleneck in linguistic diversity, where perhaps existed 7, 8 times the number of languages that exist today. The rate of language dormancy that we have seen back then, just a couple of thousand years ago, is much, much larger than the worst estimates that we have for the next 100 years. So there was this event that no one seemed to have conceptualized before of dramatic increase. We call it the golden age of linguistic diversity. Very recently in time, 2,000 years is nothing. And then a rapid decrease. Why? Well, in our model we cannot test this, but we think that the same thing that happened 2,000 years ago is approximately what happened with the Americas, right? You have a bunch of different people, pathogens spreading, and you end up with 10% of the population that existed before. We think that when the first empire started to spread and reach out places that were not available to them before, that gave rise to a leveling of human populations, either through absorption or directly extinction of individuals. Why is this important? Because if just a couple thousand years ago, we have lost the majority of the world's languages, then you don't need any special mechanism to explain why we end up with something like this. It could have perfectly been that through many thousands of generations of cultural evolution, humans chose whatever language configuration, but this huge, rapid, and dramatic event ended up with extremely skewed outcomes without having to appeal to anything functional. And there's another thing as well. What happened with the languages that have survived? There's this very popular notion going back to the 90s from the brilliant Cavalli Sforza, where he compared the haplogroups of different human societies, which are like coarse genetic markers of entire populations, against the language families. And what he observed is that there seemed to be a match between the things, meaning that languages that are related through history also tend to preserve their genetic endogeneity. Oh no, of course we can think about a bunch of exceptions, but how important are these exceptions? A few years ago, we did a worldwide analysis of this, and we found that, depending on how you measure this, but about 50% of the cases we study, we found that languages that were related, most of the time, 50% of the time, they have the nearest genetic relative being from a different language family. And why is that? Well, because humans have been exchanging culture, languages, but also genes for all of the time period we have any documentation, genetic or historical. So why is this important? Because the languages that have survived are also much less diverse because of massive amounts of contact and horizontal transfer. So, what's going on with this? The point I'm trying to make here is clear. For a number of reasons, I do think that we could have ended up with languages that were very, very different from the languages that we happen to observe and describe. And I think there's this idea that we have captured most of the important variation in the languages that we observe now, but I think that it's very likely, very plausible, that there's a lot more stuff there that could have happened or that might still be happening somewhere. Of course, we have to talk about this. It's unavoidable. We've been talking about the endangerment crisis, I don't do language documentation myself. I interact a lot with people who do, and it's people whose work I appreciate a lot. The state of funding of those initiatives have been a little bit chaotic, irregular, and sometimes tied to missions that were not necessarily concerned with humanitarian purposes or the objective description of language structures. This is a video I took 2 years ago with Nadine Grimm. We went to revisit a field site that in southern Cameroon, she was describing an interesting aspect of color terms in a bunch of different populations of hunter-gatherers. And these populations, they acquire the Bantu languages from local agriculturalists, but they didn't do it in a wholesome manner. So color terms were only slowly being acquired when she was doing this field work 12 years ago. So we go to visit one of these populations, Bagieli, in a village called Mimboso. we got there. Nadine has all of the pictures. This used to be rainforest, lush. And this is what we had today. And again, I'm someone who started just analyzing data sets in a computer, so my exposure to real linguistic diversity, it's only like 8 years old. But once you see things like this, then all of these estimates on language endangerment are just not numbers, but it's unavoidable. This is how this place looked like. It was a rainforest. And of course, what it means is that now people, the trail I was showing you before, that was a hunting trail, now people report that they take much longer to find any type of food. And if you cannot eat, what you do is just migrate to the city with all the cultural changes and the loss of linguistic diversity that entails. And again, this is a much longer discussion to have, and it's not necessarily scientific, and there's a number of very noble and important reasons that we might want to push forward for the description and the interest in linguistic diversity. And of course, I do this because I'm fascinated by languages, but that's not necessarily what happens with the rest of the world. I don't think we have been particularly successful at making the case for, why should everyone care? So I don't know to what extent I'm completely committed to this argument, but if we take this notion that something about linguistic diversity might help and might enhance representations that might result in enhanced machine intelligence, then maybe there's some VC there listening. They want to pour some money into more linguistic work. All right, so that's what I have to tell you today. Thanks for this. I've been loving NUM. Thanks to all of my fellows, and thanks to the people online. If there's anyone, I don't know. Thank you.